part of it too is like you're not allowed to block any part of the user experience behind login. They're like, oh, there's these like similar kinds of ideas, right? And we would just like point them to Hearthstone and be like,
which they gave editor's choice and featured for like weeks.
Yeah,
right?
we're like,
we mimicked their login flow.
Yeah.
So
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 421 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and my brain is a puddle.
I'm Sam and I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's June 22nd, 20 Jubilee. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. And we'd also like to thank our supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net, whose recurring donations help to keep us motivated to do this podcast. You know, the best kind of feedback is money.
Straight up cash.
As they say. Cold, hard cash. So we've been just blazing forward on Crashlands 2 stuff. We've been watching the wish lists come in, which has been great. We've been adding all kinds of features over the past couple of weeks, working on our tools, lots of stuff happening. But we don't need to get into the weeds on all that. It's mostly the kind of stuff that we've talked about 347 times before. So we're just gonna get into questions. We got 5 questions locked and loaded, and we're gonna get through all of them because we always do. We never fail.
Aim for the sky.
So let's get into it. These questions come from our listeners over at podcast.bscotch.net, and the highest upvoted question comes from FlyhoppieAxerompa, who says, Seth, are you still using VS Code? So, yeah.
Still? Is this a reference to some prior discussion?
Well, so we had talked. Yeah, so it's kind of a recap of what one of our big studio projects is. So we've been using Game Maker as our development engine to make games for 12.
Since the dawn of time.
I've been using it since 2010. And Game Maker has this interesting kind of a paradox to it, which is it's incredibly easy to sort of learn how to program in it and make games in it and stuff. And it has lots of great drag and drop features and things that are good for people who don't know how to code to make games. And also the programming language itself allows you to do just kind of whatever. Kind of whatever you want. You can even make 3D games in it, even though it's technically like mostly for 2D stuff. But there's this kind of issue where you have access to all this low level code where you can do anything, but you also kind of have to use the code to do a lot of things. So if you want to, for example, like make a really nice interface, there's no like built-in out of the box, just like easy checkboxes and buttons you could click to like make an interface for your game or whatever. And so as we've gotten deeper into using Game Maker, it just became pure code. We don't use very many aspects of the actual like IDE, the development software.
Yeah. Much of which is built around the concept of rooms and a room editor, which is almost like a level. And since we don't use that thing, then most of the like additional new functionality and stuff and ease of use tools are things that we just don't use. Does that make sense?
So like 99% of our time spent using Game Maker is just programming, using the code aspect of it. And then they've been making tons of improvements to that side of things for a long time. But there's one thing that it doesn't have, which is GitHub Copilot, which is the robot assistant that helps you write your code, which you can just get as a VS Code extension. It's just a thing you can just sign up for if you have a GitHub account, and you download this extension for VS Code, which is another code editor, and then suddenly you have this magic robot who lives in your editor, and you can do stuff like just write a comment to be like, I want to sort this list, and then it'll just be like, and it just spits out a line of code that does the thing that you type, right? So I heard a phrase as this stuff was kind of coming about, which is that the new best programming language is English, right? Which substitute your own personal language here, right? But like,
except that these tools are all being made by primarily English speakers focused on English data sets.
They are expanding though. They're expanding.
But it is actually true that you can't easily just hop to like Spanish or some other language, and get the same outcomes, since these tools aren't nearly as good.
They're trained on English.
Yeah, they're trained on primarily English.
Yeah. And so anybody who has written code before knows that there's a lot of boilerplate kind of stuff. So if you want to just like loop through a list of things and do stuff to each element in the list, like there's a specific format of like how you write that code, and it's kind of redundant. Like you have to write it the same way every time, and all that stuff. So these robot assistants do a great job of just taking care of all that boilerplate, and then you can kind of come back and like review what it wrote. And sometimes they'll write like 30, 40 lines at once. Like it's pretty crazy. But that kind of stuff is not integrated into GameMaker. And so we kind of took this as a challenge of how do we use VS Code to edit our GameMaker projects? Because also GameMaker has its own language that is not commonly used anywhere except in GameMaker, right? So it looks like JavaScript. It looks like some other programming languages.
Yeah, it's like a JavaScript C hybrid kind of a thing. But
So and also like Copilot and these kinds of things they're trained up on popular programming languages, which they can help with a lot. But if they don't know the programming language you're using, then it has to just guess, right? Which it does pretty good at. But the ultimate issue is that GameMaker just has a specifics about its programming language, about its project structure, all this stuff. And so it wasn't really feasible for us to work on our games outside of the GameMaker editor until Adam came in and was like, I'm going to solve this problem. So Adam, if you were to talk about kind of like what that actually means to work on.
Well, this is something that I'd been wanting to do for quite some time, as I think Seth would say, I'm going to test, because I've been using, so VS Code is short for Visual Studio Code. It's Microsoft's free code editor, open source.
Which is somehow way, way better than the one that isn't free.
Yeah, Visual Studio is like their flagship product, right? Which is confusing because it's called Visual Studio instead of Visual Studio Code, right? Classic Microsoft naming techniques.
And if you're not a programmer, so you don't even know what kind of we're talking about, it's sort of the equivalent of, if you wanted to write a document, you would open, say, like,
Word,
Google Docs or Word, and not Notepad, right?
Yeah, because Notepad doesn't have bold in it, for example.
Yeah,
right?
or
it doesn't have anything.
Dropping images in or whatever else. So it's the same idea, but for code stuff.
Yeah, so a code editor can do all kinds of stuff, right? The base thing that it should do is give you what we call syntax highlighting, which basically color codes the different kinds of parts of the language so that it's easier for you to look at and tell what the hell's going on, right? And then it can do any number of things beyond that. So something like Visual Studio, not Visual Studio Code, is like designed. It's like, again, it's this enormous product. It's meant for like large scale institutions who are writing like C++ and like all this kind of stuff, right? And then Visual Studio Code, VS Code, it originally was for web development. It was kind of its like thing. And that's still what it's like largely. Like the core team that does stuff is really focused on the web ecosystem. But because they have a really nice open API in an extensions market where you can make your own extensions and publish them and stuff, right? Then anybody anywhere can say, I want these other features to also exist in this code editor, right? So I've been using VS Code for a long time. I've been using it since GitHub Copilot. Like right when GitHub Copilot was announced, I was already signed up and got into the beta, and I was using that for like 6 months before it was even public. I've just been using all this stuff constantly. I'm beginning to kind of see all the really cool features roll out into VS Code because Microsoft has really just put a lot of support behind it. So there's like rolling out such nice features. I've just gotten used to just like having such nice features as an editing experience for code. Like it's handling so much stuff for me that I don't have to think very much about navigating the code base, figuring out where things are, right? It's just, if I know what I want to do, I could just go do it, right? And so then every time I flip over to GameMaker Studio, then which doesn't have a huge swath of those really nice developer features, but in particular, the robot that just can give you fancy
the robot that writes your code for you,
in particular, but even just like easy navigation around the code base and stuff, right? So every time I would bounce over there to try to do some stuff, it would just be this like cognitive load nightmare where I just like, it took so much mental effort to like figure out what I was trying to do. And then I would go try to write some code. And I would just find myself pausing, waiting for the robot to complete the thought that I had because I knew what I wanted. I just didn't want to type it. And I knew that the robot knew what I wanted and would type it for me. But then nothing happened because the robot's not there, you know? So I lost this symbiotic relationship. And so every time I came back into so basically for like the past, I want to say 1.5 years, I've gone on these like periodic sort of side project efforts, like over a few weekends or evenings and stuff, to try to figure out how to bring GameMaker editing into VS Code so I can now have all these features that I like, you know. And it wasn't until
GameMaker language is not used outside of GameMaker. So
that's where
there isn't. So VS Code doesn't know anything about it. There's not really any plugins around. I mean, there's a couple.
There was a few community extensions, but a lot of the community extension stuff too is like it's like focused on community development, right? And so the most popular extension that was out there before I jumped in, which I'd also then been using, basically just provided highlighted code support, and that was more or less it, right? But it was a hell of a lot better than just looking at like a document that's just all one color. so still very helpful. But a lot of what it was trying to do, and you'll see this actually with the GameMaker community in general, is that the GameMaker community has like gone through these phases of GameMaker versions, right? And there's always been like free components, and there's this like pool, there's like a huge pool of people who are like still on these like very legacy versions of GameMaker. A lot of it's understandable. It's what they're comfortable with. They don't want to spend the money on the new ones, you know, like it all makes sense. But I think in a lot of ways, the community stuff is held back by everyone's efforts to try to support these old ass versions of GameMaker, legacy, like really old versions. Like, so like even this extension, that was there around, supported like down to GameMaker 8, and like so much of the work that I did with GameMaker 8 was like fucking 2000s, I think, right? Like
the GameMaker 8.1 was the one that I started on in
2010,
October of 2010.
Yeah. So like you know, and in the software world, like shit moves really fast, so that's old, you know.
It's the Windows XP of
basically. Yeah, exactly. So I think a lot of the public tooling out there that the community is making, which is just very cool. There's like some very deep experts in these topics who are making cool stuff, you know. But I think they're just kind of hamstringing themselves, at least to some extent, by trying to support so much rather than just like the newest stuff, you know. So anyway, so I had the various times where I tried to like make some progress on this, but it wasn't until Seth got to really like sit down and use VS Code for a side project and to work with the robot and work with the navigation features that make VS Code just really pleasant to work in. Where then he came back just after like a weekend to GameMaker, the GameMaker editor, and was just
what the hell is this?
No. Yeah, I don't.
And then
like
I was
this.
doing that thing where I would start to write some code, and then I would wait for the robot to finish, and then I was like, "Oh right, I have to do brain," and then I would go and look around and try to figure out what I needed to do.
Yeah. So then we
you don't know what's possible until you've experienced it, and then you're like, "Ah, shit."
Yep. And so once Seth had it, because I also I was doing this as a side project because I don't normally spend my time on GameMaker, so because I'm usually writing web related code, right? And so I didn't strictly need it, so I was just doing it for fun, or trying to figure out how to do it for fun. But then as soon as Seth was like, I think I need this, I was like, yes, now I can pull the trigger on like investing the studio time to figuring out how to make this possible, right? So so now we have an extension called Stitch, which if you open up VS Code and then search your little extensions sidebar, just search for Stitch or search for GameMaker, it's, you know, it'll come up in the kinds of searches you would do. And it does a pretty good job. There's some current jank. Like I'm this final stretch of jank that by the time this podcast goes live, sure as shit better have been resolved because it's like that final piece, you know. But it's really come along, and it's actually good. But as Seth can also attest, there's jank, right, that makes it difficult. It turns out making a whole ass editor experience for code is enormously challenging along a lot of dimensions. And it's despite the fact that I'm leveraging VS Code and all of its APIs that I just have to hook into, right? But the underlying thing of like writing code that fully understands all the stuff in the project and how it all interacts with each other, right? And then surfaces that, and then makes it so that as you're editing things and updating things, that I can then also update the model of all of that and all those relationships without linkages breaking and without excess stuff still being there when it doesn't exist anymore. Like all the
or just hang time, like checking, like that the robot goes, there's too much. There's just a lot.
There's like hundreds of thousands of variables and functions and objects and assets and sprites, and like being able to write
Crashlands 2 project
like
is huge.
It's huge. And like as I start to write, this thing needs to be able to identify, what it is that I'm writing and whether or not that, I'm like using a function that already exists, or if I'm like writing a variable name with a typo, which means it has to know about all of the possible variables that I could be using, and it has to be instant. And then as soon as I write a new function or make a new thing, then every other place in the project has to know about that, right? And so there's this it's just a huge information and optimization handling problem that's just I'm very impressed.
It's very recursive.
The short answer though is that yes, you are still using it. Right.
The short answer
I'm using it. Yeah. And it's there's an interesting kind of like caveat to it, which is that
you're using it like part-time currently.
Yeah, I'm using it part-time because in a weird way, it's very much like an all or nothing kind of thing where I'll start off the day using it, and then at some point, because it's still under development, right? At some point I'll run into some aspect of it where I'm like, oh yeah, like this is actually really hard to do right now.
Yeah, some jank or missing feature.
Yeah, like, I wanted to like search for a thing in the asset tree, or I tried to search for this kind of a variable, but it turns out that that's one specific kind of thing isn't being tracked by the extension, and I can't find it. So, and then it's like I tell Adam about it, and then 2 hours later he's like, all right, that's fixed now, right? But in the meantime, I got to pop back over to the GameMaker IDE and go back and work on it there. So, but it's reaching a point where more and more of each day I'm able to stay in VS Code for longer, which means that I can find more issues. And report those. But yeah, so this was kind of the hesitation we had as well to work on this thing, was that if you don't fully recreate the feature set of the GameMaker IDE, then if you're working in VS Code, at some point you're gonna hit something you can't do, and you got to go back to GameMaker. And so we're getting to the point where those cases are becoming fewer and fewer and fewer. But yeah, if you are working in GameMaker, definitely check out the Stitch VS Code extension, because
by the time this goes live, it should be in a really good spot. It's like I made a whole bunch of fixes yesterday, and I published a bunch of them, so it's already like dramatically dejankified compared to where it was just even a day ago. But there's this one fucking thing that I just like haven't been able to figure out why it's behaving in this. I think it's this recursion problem. I just haven't been able to figure out like why it's behaving that way. And in the process of like trying to fix it, I ended up in this weirder case where now like a bunch of new surprises are happening. So I'm kind of like off on this branch over here, just
flopping
around, trying to figure out what the fuck is going on, But as soon as I know there's like some underlying thing I did dumb, right? Some like low level part of the logic, that if I can just figure out what it is, it's going to suddenly the whole thing is going to just work. It's kind of like where it's at right now, Yeah,
you got like a loose screw in the engine, and so the whole car is shaking, you know, and it's like it's just probably one thing.
Yeah, but it could be anywhere, So it's just
could be anywhere.
It's just a fucking puzzle.
Yeah, so it's been a fun ride though, and also I know that we've been hearing from announcements from the GameMaker development team that they're also working on a whole bunch of total like rebuilds of the GameMaker code editor and all that stuff. So who knows? Like maybe they'll come out with something that actually turns out to supersede the feature set that Adam's working on in VS Code.
But will it have a robot who writes your code for you? No,
that's the question.
If it doesn't, it basically doesn't matter. Is the problem?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's the killer app.
Yeah, that was our strategic bet on this. Which is like it basically doesn't matter the extent to which GameMaker updates the IDE on their own.
If they don't put that robot in there,
then the reality is like, and I've seen this already where Seth went to go write some test cases while in VS Code for, I think it was maybe a UI thing or something. There's something where it's just like you needed probably like what you thought, I think it was maybe 6 or 8 of these tests to make sure something was going to be happening.
It was code to determine the intersection of lines and line segments.
Yes. Yes. Because we found one.
Like some,
we found one like dumb error with it, basically with some pathfinding or something. So Seth was like, oh.
It was essentially if you had 2 lines that both had 0 length.
Yes.
Then it didn't know what
points,
to do.
I think.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If the start and end of the line are the same spot, then it doesn't have a slope, right?
Yep.
And then what do you
Slope is
do? Right?
undefined, I guess.
So Seth, just essentially was in VS Code and just wrote this comment of these tests, and then the fucking robot.
The comment was just, I need some tests.
Yeah, the robot spit out like 30 of them, and I was like, oh my god,
Because to test line intersections, you need to essentially in code write out a bunch of combinations of lines and different
it's like
orientations.
a combinatorial bullshit problem, right? And it's like, instead of having to think about all of it and then also manually type all of it, Seth was just like, hey, I just need some of these tests for this thing, and it's like, I got you. It's like an hour of time, and like,
it is particularly good at writing tests, and actually to the point where I had this really spooky. Everyone's like a spooky, interaction with it, where it does more than it seems like it should be able to. So because I was writing test cases for this GameMaker language parser, which is just a recursive nightmare situation, right? And the code that I wrote has an output data structure, right? But that data structure isn't like in the code, right? It's just something you infer would come out of the code, right? So I needed some test cases with where I could then pass a piece of text in that was code, right? And then it would parse it and convert it into a data structure. But again, that data structure only now lives in memory, right? It doesn't live in the code. There's nothing for the robot to look at.
So it's kind of like an analogy would be like looking at an automobile factory, right? And it's like, well, there is no car.
Yeah.
But you can see the things that are going to make the car,
right?
But you don't actually have a car right now.
So you infer what the car must look like, right?
And by looking at all the machines and stuff.
And then so I needed my test cases, right? So I was like, okay, here's a piece of code and as text, so call my parse function, hold on to that result, and I'm getting ready to write my tests now. And I'm like, oh, this is gonna suck, because it's like this deep nested data structure thing, and then it just started spitting out, because it does it like in like ghost text. You can just like hit tab to say, yes, I want this, right? And so I was ready to start typing, and all of a sudden like the ghost text appears, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, oh, this is correct actually, and so I just hit tab, to complete it, and the next line comes up and it infers like the next level deeper, and it got down to like 5 levels deep in this data structure that again didn't exist anywhere.
It just figured out that that's what was going to come
and it found like every combination of like things that I needed. So it ended up being about like, I think it was 30 different test assertions about the shape of this data.
Fantastic.
That but it just didn't live
instantly.
anywhere in the code, right? And it was what I would have written, right?
But it would have taken all day.
But it would have taken so long, because I'd be like bouncing back and forth between like the data structure in my brain and then like the thing, and then
it's just tedious shit.
It's just tedious shit.
Yeah.
So I mean, it has been the case for me that with Copilot, easily I'm spending far more of my time deciding what I want to do and far less of my time doing it, right?
Worrying about the details.
Yeah, because and even when I do worry about the details, I don't have to make my hands move to put the details in place, right? So I'm mostly like planning code and then reading code, right? And it is still the case that like it's not good enough that it's literally writing all the code for me, right? So I'm still writing 30 to 50% of the code itself, right? But most of what I'm doing really is just like writing enough code that the robot can see what I'm doing and then accurately infer what I'm trying to do, and then just kind of do the rest.
It's kind of like when you see a dad and a son and the son is on a bike with training wheels, and then the dad like gets him started
and let's go,
pushes him, and then he starts going, right? It's like the co-pilot is the kid in this scenario, right? You just got to get him enough speed that they can start pedaling on their own, which is way easier than like riding the bike yourself. You just stand there and like give a little push, Yeah. So
long story short, it's like having these robot tools is extremely valuable and saves so much time and cognitive load, and so we need it. And as Seth said, like, it's possible that Game Maker will at some point. I would bet if it happens, it won't be for a year plus, but at some point they may actually just do some integration of these tools, right, into their system. But like, we can only hope that we can then stop supporting this thing that we're building and just go use what they're using, right?
Yeah. Well, we also have to recognize that like Game Maker as a product is probably mostly aimed at non-programmers. It has all these drag and drop features and stuff like that. And so, we recognize that the priority for them to make these like really advanced code features is further down on the list than it is for us, right? And so it's like, okay, that's fine. Like we can still use the runner, use the engine, all that stuff, and we'll just edit the code in somewhere else. And
yep. And if we
still
need to use
their
engine,
so
and if they use their interfaces to make it really easy to manage some asset thing that we don't want to fuck with, and whatever, we'll switch over to Game Maker to use it. So the idea is not to completely replace the IDE or the Game Maker tooling, right? It's basically to say we want the best possible coding experience that we can get, because that's what most of our time is just planning and then writing and then reading code, right? And that should be a really, really good experience. And so with the tooling that VS Code has just built into that editor that we can hook into, and then with robots like Copilot, like that's how we get that. And so it's worth the investment, and it's worth, Seth spending this like the morning using it, putting up with some jank while we figure things out, reporting bugs, then switching back off for the rest of the day. Like as we kind of figure it all out. So yeah,
even with the jank, it's still great.
Yeah, so, I recommend giving it a try and seeing how it works. And again, the main caveat is that we're building this to support what we're trying to do, right? So inevitably at some point someone will come in and be like, oh, hey, like this doesn't support my 2-year-old version of Game Maker, which isn't that old, right? But
too bad. Get on. We're not join us in the future.
Old. Yeah, exactly. So we won't. So like we won't be, because like also the thing is, it's not even a matter of like, oh, because it's open source, so like a person could fork it, add their own support for something, and then ask for us to merge it back in, right? And I think my policy is going to be anything that is for old versions of Game Maker, I'm going to say no to, because those things have to be maintained. It's once they're in the code base, right?
Yep.
So the idea is, exactly. The idea is that this should behave like the Game Maker IDE itself, in the sense of like the Game Maker IDE just converts old projects into the new format if it needs to or whatever, right? Which we won't be doing probably, but it does that. It doesn't say like, oh yeah, you can use this editor to just edit projects from 6 years ago exactly the same way you're editing them then, right? Like there's a reason you don't do that. It's because maintaining such a thing is the biggest nightmare in the universe. And eventually all you're doing is
innovation.
Is maintaining,
all you're doing is supporting legacy shit.
Exactly, rather than actually adding cool new stuff.
Yeah, we've been through our own journey with that, which we can talk about another time. Yep. Well, let's get on to the next question from Bupanoilie Rolleepa, who says, "How does Netflix games work? Is it similar to services like Apple Arcade and Google Play Pass? Are you considering putting the original Crashlands or any of your other games on there, or would that depend on how Crashlands 2 performs?"
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, it's interesting. So because Netflix Games Service is newer, there's still a bit of confusion about how it actually works when we say something like, oh, yeah, it's going to be on Netflix, for example. So what it means is that actually you'll get the game still through the usual means. In other words, at the end of the day, you're going to download it from Google Play or from the App Store, because that's just where the data for the builds is stored, etc. Right. So the difference in flow is basically that most people who get the game would basically, the way you do it is you're already logged into Netflix on your phone or your tablet or whatever, and then you can see games listed within that application, within the Netflix application. And
if you open it on your mobile device, if you just like scroll down a little bit on the home page, I think there's also a games tab across the bottom.
Yeah. Well, so the difference is if you're on iOS, this might be part of the confusion, because you cannot see those things on the iOS version of the Netflix app.
Because you're not allowed to have a store as an app, and that now counts as a store.
Right. So yeah, even linking, if for Netflix to link to the games that's in their portfolio from inside their app, Apple considers that to be like a store, I think.
So I think they've managed to, I think, again, because Apple's sort of teetering on this edge of their monopoly problem, right? Which is that they're behaving so strictly with regards to their storefront that there's been enough. I mean, everyone's seen this with the epic battles and stuff like that.
With regard to games, more specific.
Yes, with regard to games, a lot of developers have had. You see, like Roblox pivoting to the idea that what they're doing is selling experiences within the Roblox application, not other games.
Could be anything. It's just an experience.
And so this basic problem is that basically you have this monopoly behavior happening primarily on like the Apple side of things, which this is not news. They've been doing this forever, where it makes it very hard if you're trying to run a subscription service yourself under those services. So whereas with Apple Arcade, you're going to like go to the arcade tab and then you just hit get, right? And you get it because that is the same thing as the store. On the Netflix one, there's essentially just a layer of an intermediate as far as finding the games, which is you do it through the Netflix app. So even if you are on iOS, you can search for a game and it'll still show up, right? You'll still see them there, but you won't see them on the store.
The app store.
Yeah, they can't just like show them on the browsing section. So all you do is you just click on that, and that actually just takes you to, it's a deep link. It just takes you to the store. So either the App Store or Google Play for that game. And then you hit get, you get it. And then when you boot the game up, it just uses your Netflix login credentials, which you probably already are logged in because you just got there from the Netflix app. And then now you're playing the game, right? And they got the usual kind of almost like the SDK stuff. So you're logged in with your Netflix thing. You can have gamer handles, like cloud saves. They have all that stuff, and they're always adding more all the time. So it works basically. It's essentially the same as what you'd see from Google Play Pass or Apple Arcade.
Yeah, I would say it's most similar
the Netflix app.
Yeah, I would say it's most similar to Play Pass, like experientially, right? In the sense that like Play Pass is like there's a separate thing you can go look at that's Play Pass, right? But what you do in that thing is you're shown games that are in Play Pass, but when you click on them, it goes to its regular Play Store page, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And it's just kind of flagged as like, oh, this is a Play Pass game. It's a really similar idea to that. So what you'll see, I assume, is that also Crashlands 2 will, instead of being under like the Butterscotch publisher, it'll be under the Netflix publisher.
Yeah, it would be under Netflix publisher.
Yeah. And so it'll be part of like their publisher collection of games. And like Sam said, you basically would just like download it. And then if you are already logged into Netflix, you'll just also already be logged into the game, which is going to be really slick. So
that's it.
Yeah, that's it. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, if you used any other kind of subscription service to play games, whether it's Xbox Game Pass or Google Play Pass or Apple Arcade, like any of those things, it's not really going to work any different from what you're used to.
Yeah. So as far as like it is on, I guess that's the clarifying point. It is on Android and iOS, right? Yeah. Like it's on those platforms. You get it through those storefronts the same way you ended up would. It's just that the entry point probably is one layer higher, which is like through the Netflix app for most people who are finding it.
And even if it's not, if you just find it, because you will, they should show up at searches in their stores and stuff the same way any other app would. So the only difference there is that when you boot it up, you would just be faced with a Netflix login screen. And that's the only difference, right?
Yep. Pretty straightforward. And I think one of the interesting things that we've kind of seen in this space over the years is, like Sam was saying, kind of that difference between how these things, it's like slight difference between how these things work on Google Play versus Apple. And there's been lots of like legal fights and pressure to try to like get Apple to be more lenient toward, something like this, where because I totally understand why. We even saw some comments when we launched the game where people are like, Netflix has games, right? Yeah. Because like if you're on, especially if you're on iOS, and like I was confused because like on my Android device, I've been seeing on the Netflix app forever. There's like a game
feels like forever. Yeah,
that's pretty obvious,
I think
right?
That's
and I was like, how do people not know
confusion?
This,
Yeah, I guess part of the thing that leads to the confusion, right? Because you have these two very large audiences. I mean, like the total Netflix subscriber base is like 220 million people, right?
It's big.
It's humongous, and it's not. It's like at that scale, you're going to have representation pretty well, like sort of market distribution wise for Android and iOS devices, right? So it's going to be like
it's like half and half.
It's like half and half. So you have a group of people who anytime they open the Netflix app for the past like year has probably been seeing the games. And then you have the other group who has not been seeing the games. You're sort of at a baseline. And so, having this thing where it's like, what do you mean there's games? People be like, what do you mean there's not games?
Like, how do you not know that? It's sort of, because nobody knows like the legal stuff going on in the background where, Apple has certain terms of how you can portray these things and Google doesn't have those same restrictions.
It does. It's just less restrictive, right? Because they still have policies about because one of the things that like Apple claims its main reason, though I'm pretty sure that's not true, but they claim their main reason is they're trying to avoid store manipulation by people using like one app to make it so that they're sending traffic to other apps and somehow unfairly manipulating things in the background, right? And I don't buy that as the claim, but there's definitely a piece of that. And I think like if you're looking at the policies that like Google Play has about how you display this stuff, it does seem like mostly those concerns on the Google Play side are oriented around that of like, sure, you're allowed to have a store within the store, right? But you have to be really careful about how all of it works. And
I do remember actually we ran into problems where like in the earlier days, we wanted to cross-link our games on iOS. We wanted to link people from Quadrupus Rampage to Towelfight and Flop, and that stuff. And we weren't allowed to do that because of their stipulation
we were allowed to. We just, not the original way we did it. Because the original way we did it included an in-game reward of some sort, if you remember.
Oh, yeah.
It was cross-promotion thing.
It was a cross.
You would get like a couple doubloons in Quadrupus or something.
So it was basically we could tell people about it. We just couldn't incentivize them to go visit the store page. Because that was where then the market manipulation sort of concept came into play.
They called it unfair manipulation of App Store rankings, I believe was the
That's
term.
right.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of, and those guidelines and terms for all the stores, they shift monthly, in the slightest ways. And so like over the course of 10 years
enforced, so.
Because it's still people evaluating the apps at the end of the day, whether an app meets the guidelines. And so
that's always one of our frustrations too, as a smaller player in the space compared to, some of the juggernauts, because I remember in the earlier days of Butterscotch ID, we had a hell of a time. It would be like every fourth submission or something like that to the App Store.
Be like, no.
The review would be like, you're not allowed to do this. Just like have
have a login.
Have a login and stuff. And then our response is always basically just, and part of it too is like, you're not allowed to block any part of the user experience behind login. They're like, there's these like similar kinds of ideas, right? And we would just like point them to Hearthstone and be like,
which they gave editor's choice and featured for like weeks.
Yeah,
right? We mimicked their login flow.
Yeah.
So,
and that was actually that was always the way we got back out of it when they kicked us out of the thing, was basically just say like, hey, here's your hypocrisy on display. Now let us through. Right.
And they're like, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, it's inconsistent, right? Because like it's a huge organization and the guidelines are not strict. There's no obvious like
there's room for interpretation.
There's always room for interpretation. And we've run into things like, oh yeah, like this icon is like 3% too small, rejected, or and not even just Apple, but like in other things we've submitted to, like, oh yeah, you had a line break in the text here and there shouldn't be one, rejected, right? So it's all kinds of stuff like that. And then, at the same time, you'll see just absolute bug-ridden stuff just sail through, no problem. So it's not consistent, but these are the kinds of things that now, that like I'm sure behind the scenes, like Netflix is probably talking to Apple and Google just all day, like this, duking out, figuring out how to get this thing off the ground. Yeah. So
we've seen lots of these over the years too, like different third parties trying to build subscription services or collections of games with cross promo features and stuff on the platforms. And it's always run into these policy issues, and players mostly weren't big enough to really like force the issue. Right. Yeah. And I think you have though in Netflix and also Epic, which was trying to do some other stuff, but
Roblox. I mean, you got like there's all these big entities that are they're doing.
Yeah, they're finally like big enough that they can make enough noise against these $1 trillion companies. That things have changed enough that we can then have these kinds of cool.
Yeah, and it's kind of weird too if you think about like how arbitrarily the lines are drawn. Because if you kind of think about it, like if you think about these app stores like a shopping mall, right? It's like they own the space, and anybody who wants to operate in that space is going to have to essentially, pay the middleman. You got to pay your rent, and there's like maintenance fees and whatever else, right? And then like the mall will have rules about what you can and can't do on their premises, right? Like you probably can't set up a giant display that blocks foot traffic in the hallway.
Certain kinds of shops aren't allowed. Can't be just like selling, I don't know, illicit black market goods. guns.
Yeah, you can't put up your gun store and your porn shop and your liquor store and all that stuff, right? But you can have a chocolate store, like so. They have all these rules, right? And if you want to operate in their space, you got to follow the rules, right? And I think the digital space is like an interesting one because nothing is real. Like everything is. It's all arbitrary. It's all arbitrary. Yeah. You can kind of fudge things around. So, for example, like you can't have an app store. You can't make your own app store and then publish that on the app store because they're like, well, like we're the ones who has the app store, right? But you can publish a game that has a store in it that sells cosmetics and coins and all kinds of other stuff.
You can have a store in your app.
You can have a store in your app, but you can't have an app store in the app store, And so it's like it's a strange distinction to be like you can sell these kinds of things in your game or in your app, but you can't sell these other kinds of things. But that's just what it is, and they're the gatekeeper. So if you want it to change, you got to talk to them, right? So it's pretty interesting. All right, next question comes from Ticklesaurus Rex.
Oh, that's good.
Which I can't imagine works that well because, short arms and stuff.
Well, are you tickling the T-Rex or is it tickling you?
Well, it's the Ticklesaurus Rex, so I'm assuming that the Rex is the tickler. Yeah.
Maybe that's a variant that has really long fingers. Still short arms, but just real.
And I assume feathers because come on. All right, Ticklesaurus Rex says, "Hello, bros. At long last, Crashlands 2 has been revealed. Just wanted to know what your plans are in regard to revealing content about Crashlands 2 over time. Will you feed us snippets of goodies along the way until launch? Also, will crafting depend on tools or these can be leveled up the more you use them? Thanks, bros. Longtime fan." Cool. I can talk about the tools. I can talk about the tools thing first.
Yeah, it's a quick one. Go for it.
Yeah. So in the first game, you had very specific tools. So you had like a saw, and then once you have the saw, then any time you click on a thing that the saw can be used for, it would just go into your hand and you would hit it. So although that is quick and simple and easy from a gameplay perspective, it's also very constrained, right? Because it's like that model means that everything that you have can only be used for one thing, right? And it's always going to be used in the same way where like if you have a saw, it's going to chop one thing at a time and all it's going to do is chop things. There's also no better way to wield it, which is one of the things we were trying to crack, right? Which is like, can we shift this design a little bit so that you could have a better swing? You know what I mean? Like you have somehow chosen to swing better. With this. Or they're like finding a particular pattern or like situation like of like resource arrangement of resources. You're like, ooh, this is really good for this particular saw that I have. Exactly. As opposed to just like click on one, click on the other, click on the other, click on the other, and then move on. Right. So we have tools in the game that are used for, chopping plants or mining or whatever. And we do have like higher versions of them that do a better job at that and have like slightly larger areas and stuff. But they're used in a little bit of a different way with a lot more possibilities for flexible things to happen. So the big difference is that they have telegraphs. So if you played the first game, that the telegraph system was kind of like, which is something that I think we ripped it from WildStar, which came out like around that time.
It's just like we actually didn't pattern projected on the ground showing you where damage will appear.
Yeah. And we didn't have that, I think, in the first like 6 months of the first Crashlands development. And we found that combat was just like it was too hard to figure out like where to go to avoid stuff. And
if you played Don't Starve, you know this problem, which is that animations that are fun typically have a hard time accurately matching where they're going to hit. And then you have to, it can be part of the fun for people. Also. Yeah, it can be part of the fun for people of like learning, combat, knowing kind of exactly how far something hits, whatever else. But it also is deeply frustrating to not be able to just die,
and then you're like, how was I supposed to know?
Especially when death is extremely punishing, like
in the case of Starve. Yeah. So we're really trying to solve that problem, particularly, which is like, okay, we want to be able to do whatever animations we want. and potentially have different interesting attack patterns appear, but not have to blend those, not have to force those together in a way that then also creates this kind of obfuscation where you can't quite tell where the edge is, and you got to
well, and the art demands are really high if you have to like make a custom animation that exactly maps onto every attack pattern, you know. So we had that telegraph system in the first game, but that was mostly about like things hitting you. Like you're avoiding these telegraphs that are coming at you, and you would sometimes have like a gadget or something that would like make like a circular telegraph and hit, like set things on fire or something. But mostly it was the stuff that you had was like single targeted, where you would just pick a thing and use your weapon or tool on that thing, and you didn't have quite as many like telegraph or area based things. So at Crashlands 2, we're like, well, we want to switch that focus so that if you have telegraphs for most of your things, then that actually creates interesting positional situations. So if you have a certain shape to your like mining pick swing area, or a certain shape to the area that your machete hits for chopping plants or something, then if you see a few plants that are kind of like in a little cluster, then that's way more exciting than a single plant off on its own, because you can get over there and like arrange yourself to try to catch all the plants in the telegraph. Right?
You can actually have these like, it's essentially skill based like amplification of that system, then, right? You can learn how to position yourself around things. You can get excited about the positioning of elements in the world, as opposed to just being like, yep, there's another one. Man, there's another one.
Yeah, and so the tools then in Crashlands 2 follow that pattern, but also we don't have the concept of like there's a dedicated slot for your saw and a dedicated slot for your fishing pole. You know, instead we just have a toolbar which has 4 slots in it, and then we have a variety of tools, including things like harvest bombs and stuff like that, which we consider tools because you use them to harvest in the same way that you harvest with a plant chopper, right? And so we're, you know, part of it is upgrading those over time and like building better versions of the same tool. And then also another part of it is discovering more specialized tools or consumable items that
you could choose to use.
Yeah, you can like slot those into your toolbar instead. So it's interesting because it's like it's not as, I mean, that was going to sound kind of negative, but it's not as brain dead as the original mechanics were. Like literally all you did was click a thing and then no thought. Now it's more like you can you can get better results by thinking more about what it is that you're going to do, right?
But you can opt into it, and that's part of the idea of what we're trying to do with Crashlands 2. Also, the idea of sort of progressive difficulty enhancement, right? With the idea of we want it so that you can have a fair, because the way that I like to play games is the brain dead way, where it's just like that's why I like first person shooters. It's just like shoot something. I did it now, and we want to make room for people to engage with Crashlands 2 at a wide scale of sort of depth of interaction and still have the good time that they want to have. And so we're trying to make it so that you can still recapture what Crashlands felt like to play with its general simplicity, right? And approachability, but then also be able to push that a lot further for people who are into that. Yep.
Yeah. And we're also kind of, we're still iterating through all this stuff, right? And so we have a long time to go. So don't take any of this. Yeah. Don't take any of this stuff as locked in. But our plan with the like equipment and weapons as well is kind of actually similar to what we've done with the world, which is in the first game, the stats and everything on all of your equipment was fully randomized, right? And then the world itself was also randomized. And so, we'd like to think that, oh yeah, every playthrough is different, right? So like, it's not that different.
Experientially, it's not.
Yeah, two different random outcomes are not necessarily experientially different, just because they're so technically different.
It's like, as an example, like if you craft a sword at level 3 and it has a poison proc on it, so sometimes when you swing, it'll poison things. You don't know that when you build your next sword, it's also going to have a poison proc. It might have lightning or fire or something, which means that just because you got this poison sword doesn't mean you can go out of your way to do stuff to like become a poison-based character.
Yeah, because you can basically choose a play style experience and build around it super meaningfully.
Yeah,
you can buy gambling, right? Because then you just have to put more money into the to the sword machine to see if you can get the thing that you want.
Yeah. And so we also wanted to essentially our one of our design pillars that we're trying to lean into is this idea of player expression and player choice that actually results in meaningful differences in experiences and outcomes. And so to that end, we're also looking into, instead of having all these randomized pieces of equipment, to have authored items that are specifically for a thing, right? So you'd have like gear sets that are built around poison. And you would sort of like upgrade those over time, like if you choose to go down that track. And it's not exclusive. It doesn't keep you from going back and like building a different kind of equipment set as well. Maybe like a lightning one, or we've got all kinds of other weird stuff. I'm just kind of using references from the first game. So much in the same way that the tools grow and upgrade over time, and then also become more diverse in their capabilities. We're doing the same thing with the gadgets and the trinkets and the armor and the weapons and all of that stuff. So it's the game definitely feels like it opens up, and kind of like our goal is to have it so that it feels like the game is reading your mind. Where if you start playing, you're like, oh, I wish I had X. And then a few minutes later, the game is like, here's a recipe for X. And you're like, ooh. Right. So that's the thing that we're trying to hit, which is a big reason why we're putting so much investment into tooling so that we can author all of this content and deliver it. So that's as far as like the tools progression and kind of how all that works. As far as how we're going to unveil stuff over time.
Yeah, I think about two ways. I think one is the podcast is sort of like the informal channel where, kind of like Seth, this time here, it's just kind of like if there's a question or something we want to address, then the thing is the podcast audience is a smaller portion of the total kind of broadcasted audience that we can reach with both the Ballyhoo as well as our Steam announcements and stuff like that.
And the Ballyhoo is our newsletter. Yeah,
the Ballyhoo is the newsletter. And so the more, I guess, more official communications as far as content go, our rough plan is about every 4 to 6 weeks to be sharing something about the game, or about kind of design intent, even like a deep dive on a particular creature or whatever else. And those are probably going to take a variety of formats, but they're generally going to be going through the newsletter system. So if you're not signed up for that, definitely get on that. They'll be posted as blogs, and then kind of just around, in various channels and things like that. But the formats will probably vary quite a bit because we're also just kind of experimenting with what kinds of content as well as what formats of content have good reach and resonance with people. Right. So like our trailers always do very well, for example, because they're just kind of dumb fun, but they're also really heavy to put together. So we don't want to necessarily have to spend all the time putting together a trailer every 4 to 6 weeks for a particular system, even though the game's deep enough that we could. And so it's kind of like, how do we take some of the ideas present in the game that are really fun or that have the opportunity to resonate with people or be punched up with a little bit of humor, and then either through just a simple written thing or a really quick, goofy video of some sort that isn't hard to put together, share a bit of that. So I think largely if you're in the Discord, if you're on the newsletter, you'll probably be able to see stuff about every 4 to 6 weeks, just little tidbits here and there about stuff we got going on.
Yeah. And like Sam said, I mean, we don't necessarily know exactly what will resonate with people. So we'll probably try some things like,
it's going to be
interested in
a diversification, right? So,
yeah. And like, I'd be interested in, doing a newsletter. It's like, oh yeah, like here's how building works in Crashlands 2. Like, and so it's interesting on its own, but then also if you played the first game, then you can kind of, you'll be able to you'll clearly be able to spot the differences between how this works and how the first one worked.
Yeah. And I think it would be fun for Crashlands 2 also to have some more technical deep dives for the part of the audience who's into that kind of a thing, and that's part of what I mean too by diversifying. It's not just like the format and that kind of stuff, but also like, it was kind of like we talked about a lot last week's episode. It was about because we were talking about community building, right? And like, and it's really getting to the idea that like there are just different groups of people, right? That
care about different stuff
that make up your audience. That sure, they maybe are all technically like your audience in some way or another, but there's a lot of sort of non-overlapping domains. And so like in our case, we've got original Crashlands players. Like what they're into is like they already have tons of background knowledge about Crashlands, the franchise or the IP, right? And so what they want to know is like, am I going to see these characters again? You know, like, am I going to participate in the stories again? And how does this look compared to original Crashlands? And then we have people who never played Crashlands who saw the trailer and they're like, oh, this looks really cool, right? But don't have any of that context. So they don't care about changes from OG Crashlands. They just want to know, what is this game like, right? And then we have our more technical audience who's like either just fellow game developers or people who are into just how games are made and also Crashlands, right? For whom like being able to show some stuff about like what our developer tools look like. And Seth has some very fucking cool like in-game developer features to display stuff to you so you can get a sense of like, and I think the build mode stuff is particularly cool because I think it's like a deep dive. It looks really neat, but also as a deep dive of like, what are the problems related to this and why is it hard? When you turn the tooling on and are kind of walking through it, you get to actually visually see like the stuff that's hard and see it happening. And I think it'll be really fun to be able to share that kind of stuff as well as like more marketing-y like stuff targeted for.
Yeah. Well, I think about
players,
like the major communications we'll be doing will be more of the mass audience reach stuff, which is it's more about the design or the experiential intent of these things, not necessarily the kind of like
the how it works.
Here's how the sausage is made, you know, and then we might link to stuff like that in those moments as like if you want to learn more, Seth posted a blog about like the technical nonsense about this.
Yes, we might do like occasionally like YouTube videos about the game changer, or like Adam said, about our developer tooling or our world editor that we made for Crashlands. You know,
we've also talked
just
about
to kind of like talk about it. And
a lot of the dev stuff, you know, from our experience, is way more impactful when we do it post launch, because that's when other people are asking, how the fuck did you make that? Not before the game comes out, right? So that's
nobody cares. How are you making this thing that I don't know about? Like nobody cares about it.
So I think a lot of there's kind of this cadence to content. I think that's kind of interesting and in its own little puzzle to solve. And we'll be doing some experiments, I think, in the next while to kind of just start poking around that, see what we can do. Yeah.
So so I hope that answers the question. And that's all the time we have. We got through 3. I'm pretty proud. Pretty good. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. And as always, head over to Steam and be sure to wishlist Crashlands 2 if you haven't done it yet. It helps juice the numbers, get that thing moving up the algorithm, and gets shown to more people, and it gets that Katamari ball rolling. So we appreciate that. And thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.